I just want to welcome you all here at this meeting this morning. We are very happy that you could take the time out to join us this morning. June McKinnon is going to tell us about her research under the old people in the archives. She doesn't just go for names, she goes for the Jews. Okay? June has written a couple of books and her stories are very interesting.
Welcome, everybody. Good morning. My book, Wine, Woman, and Good Hope, it was a history of scandalous behavior at Cape, a romp through the history they never dared to teach you at school or university. When I researched my first book, A Tapestry of Lives, 17 Cape Women at the Cape, I wondered who the descendants of these feisty women were. 50% of them were my ancestors. And afterwards, compiling trees for friends and family for fun, I was often met by disbelief that their ancestors had got up to such high jinks. This led me to write the book. Jan van Riebeeck had a lot to answer for. Besides planting his company garden, he planted barley for beer, vines for wine, and with all the passing ships was a great trade, and the free burghers were granted licenses to make wine and beer. It rebounded on him. He complained that whenever ships were in the harbour, the locals spent days drinking, brawling, and lying around idly from the profit from the booze. And for almost the next 50 years, there were more pubs than there were houses at the Cape. One of my ancestors was Tielman Hendricksz. He had a foul temper. He was voted on the Heemraad, but soon dismissed because he attacked people, even tried to knife somebody. He was the manager of Van Riebeeck's farm 8 Cape, and in 1661 he bought 50 Morgan, on which Goeie, the barn for storing corn, stood. This building still stands under the bridge of the Riebeeck Parkway at Settlers Way. He sold brandy and arrack was a cheap, high alcohol content wine made from rice and very, very cheap gin made in Holland. Another ancestor, Jacob Roosendaal, gave him big competition because he sold very good wine from grapes on his farm, Boshevel. And his wife, Katrine, was a good businesswoman. She offered the first cup of wine free. Tielman's wife, Macon, was furious. She spread the rumor that free wine was not the only thing that Katrine was offering, because she said Katrine had been a prostitute in the Netherlands, she was a gutter snipe, and her father was in a workhouse. Katrine took Macon to the Council of Justice and fined, and it was fined for slander. She was fined for slander. Carl Skimmen, that eminent historian, warned South Africans, don't look for your ancestors in the mirrored halls of Versailles, the gilded palaces of Europe, but look in the back streets of Europe and small holdings. The 30 Years' War in Northern Europe, there was unemployment, increase in food prices and essentials, high inflation, corruption. Hello, South Africa. The VOC was the richest and largest commercial company operating. Desperate men flocked to enlist as soldiers, sailors, clerks, ship surgeons, any post that was available. Not fussy, they were sent to the east or the small Kaapse Mense. The tough male settlers were always ready for a fight. They carried knives and sticks with them, and the women clawed and pulled each other's hair. After a year, after Stander case, Tielman and Jacob went at it again, fighting each other. Jacob laid into Tielman with a stick, and still Tielman knifed him. He is the first ancestor, the first person actually in South Africa to be arrested for drunk driving. In 1662, his neighbor, another ancestor, German Hans Rust, married Katharina Oostings. There was a merry party at the small fort. There wasn't a castle yet. And the guests in their cups drove back to their farms in their wagons. Tielman raced his wagon along the narrow path, swearing and singing, and he collided with the bridal wagon. Hans jumped off and told Tielman to stop swearing in front of his bride. Maken grabbed Hans by the hair and pulled it while Tielman knifed Hans in the ribs. The hilt broke off. Hans spent 2 months in hospital, where the surgeon was Peter van der Merwe, another of my ancestors. His father was a soldier, and he was born in the grounds of this castle, which Shakespeare called Elsinore and put Hamlet in the castle. And he was a ship surgeon. And when he arrived here, he married Eva. Her name was Crota Mansell. Up and told me that is wrong. It should be Crotwa. And descended from them, besides me, are famous people: Daniel Matier, Dan Slee, Mansell Upham, F.W. de Klerk, Jannie Smit, and Paul Kruger. Right, next slide. And there we have Crotwa, and there we have Simon van der Stel. Hans's first marriage ended when he was attacked by a lion on his farm. It took him 2 months to die of septicemia. And about 2 years later, Katrijn married again, but he was a useless farmer, and he went off on a hunting expedition to Macassar Beach, where Chief Gonimer was. One of the other guys with him was Tielman. Only 2 of them came back. They were all massacred. So 2 years later, Katrijn married again, and she had to sell the farm, and she moved into a small house in the town. And this husband, he was another German, he went off bounty hunting for hippos. And while he was bounty hunting, he was killed by an elephant. She had 5 small children. She was pregnant at the time. So after the baby was born, she had to go down to the castle and beg for a rice ration for widows. And this is a juicy part. There she met Simon van der Stel. He hated his wife. He left her in the Netherlands. And he had, according to Margaret Cairns, he had several mistresses here. The husbands never complained because they've got cattle or bits of land. And she became one of his mistresses. He was 36, she was 40. And in the end, she said, look, I want to farm again. So he said, fine, I'll give you this piece of land at Steenberg, which she called Swanewede, which is now the Steenberg Golf Estate, because at the time, Fred Constantius ground went all the way there. And he said, I need someone to look after the cattle on the plot next door. And she must have been a pretty good mistress, because about 2 years later, this poor woman had, according to Van Riedetor Drakenstein, commissioner for the VOC, the record is in the South African Library. She had vineyards, an orchard, corn, cattle, pigs, poultry, sheep. And if you want to know how wealthy your ancestors were, look for the slaves. Male slaves were more expensive than female. She had 6 male slaves and 1 female. And then something unheard of happened. Women were never allowed to get a title deed, even if they were the ones running the farm. The title deed would go to a nephew or anybody like that, or a brother. Van der Stel gave her a title deed, and it was on the wall of the restaurant Katarina's named after her. And then she married again, a German toy boy. He was a manager. He was 25, and she was 40. And as Simon van der Stel was dying, she sold up and they moved to Justenburg, and she bought the farm Justenburg. Right, next ancestor. Here we have Willem Van Der Merwe. He was a huge man. He was over 6 foot, very well built. He was an officer, which was, if you can see the gun over his shoulder, that's a flintlock. And that stick he's carrying with the fork in it, to fire that gun, even a big man like him, he had to dig it into the ground and rest the gun in there to fire it, or he would be blown backwards. And he owned the farm Falkenberg, one stage. Right, there we go. But he started off as a knecht. because the company couldn't afford to pay all their soldiers and sailors. So they hired them out privately or used them themselves as farmhands. And he was a farmhand at Kritsia. And there he met a black slave, Coddo of New Guinea, and he fell in love with her. And she was expecting a child. And while she was in labor, they called him, and he was horrified at the pain she was in. So twice a day, slaves and knicks could get a brandy ration. So he ran to the captain and he said, please, I want one for me and one for Coddo. And he said, nonsense, I'm only going to give one. So he boxed the captain's ears. And he should have got into trouble for that, but the captain said he was a good worker, so at least he offered, gave him the 2 rations. So he went back, and his daughter Maria, called Van der Merwe, was born. And he wanted to buy her, but he couldn't afford her because she was a company slave. And as she got older, she became one of Simon van der Stel's slaves. And he was so impressed with her that she was one of the 4 slaves that when he died, she was freed in his will. And she married a Haynes, so she is the ancestor of the Haynes family. And then Van der Merwe married Elsie Klutti, and his father-in-law and himself, both of them, when their wives died, that were in trouble all the time because they had numerous affairs with their koi servants and their slaves. Right, now we get to the Trekboers. There you see the Trekboers trekking up, and my lot went up to the Northwest Cape. And that is Hermanus Engelbrecht. There you can see his little thatched roof house. He was the last farm up over the Kammersberg. And you can see his little wagons and the little thatched houses are where his koi servants lived. And he was visited by Colonel Gordon, by James Patterson, and Le Valiant. Now, Le Valiant was French. And he came here and he was treated royally by the society in Cape Town. He was fed and feasted and everything, and he loved it. And then, of course, he trekked up country, and he didn't understand how hard the life was for the Trekboers and how the basic conditions of their living. He hardly wrote anything good about them. He slammed them like anything, and he was a terrible man. He had a wife and 3 children in Paris who were on the breadline, and he was sending them no money, and he was just living like a king. He stayed with another ancestor, Cornelius van der Merwe, whose wife, Cornelia. Right, he stayed with Cornelius van der Merwe, whose wife, Cornelia, was Hermanus Engelbrecht's sister. And he said she was a total liar. She said that she could speak French, and he said it was garbled rubbish. And she wasn't a liar. Her mother was Jean Guillemey, which the Dutch changed to Johanna Guillemey. And they were, her father and mother were resident in Berlin, where they were in the silk trade, and they were invited out here by the VOC. And Spin Street behind Parliament in Cape Town is where the factory was. And that's where they had the silkworm spinning. And my husband's uncle at one stage was manager of the brandy farm in Stellenbosch, where there were mulberry trees planted. Those mulberry trees are still there. And he wrote that the Engelbrechts were a disgusting family. They stank, they drank, they ate raw meat, they bribed, and it was absolutely awful. And then he went to go and stay with Hermanus Engelbrecht, and he said the same thing about them. And he said, but all the daughters were idiots, and they tried to dress up and seduce them. Well, when Colonel Gordon and James Patterson went to stay with the families, the story was totally different. They were met at the door by the mothers with shamboks, and they said, if you dare lay a hand on our daughters, we'll shambok you. This horrible Valiant tried to seduce them, not the other way around. And there was a widow for Yun who stayed nearby, and she said, yes, he was a liar. He took a stuffed lion's head back to Cape Town. He said he shot it said it's rubbish. My koi servant shot it with a poisoned arrow. These aren't my ancestors anymore. Gerrit Maritz, the Groottrek. He also had a very bad temper, but he came from a very dysfunctional family. His father was very dejected, very sad, very depressed, quiet man who was struggling endlessly on this farm. But his mother was a virago. She was a religious fanatic. From the time her children could speak, she drummed bits of the Bible and religious texts into them, and she forced them at each mealtime to say something. If they didn't get it correct, she'd thrash them with a shamrock, as young as they were, put them in a corner, and they weren't allowed any food. So that was his background. She had one daughter only, Susanna. She was only 13 years old when she forced her to marry this guy. There we go. Look at him. Would you like to marry him? I don't think so. His name was Erasmus Smit. He was 34. He came from the Netherlands. He wasn't even a fully qualified missionary, but he was the only one that was willing to go. They forced him out here. I think he must have been dyslexic. He could hardly write, he could hardly read. And because of that, he was always drinking. He had 2 missions which failed, mission stations. He was thrown out. And 15 years old, Susanna produced a son, Hermanus, who very sadly died on the fruit trek. And then they were sitting on her mother's farm, and then a post became available in Stellenbosch. And Susanna didn't want to go because it was the middle of the wine industry. They'd already had 2 organists that had been dismissed because they were drunk, each shy. So off they went, and they went there, and of course he drank himself under the covers, and he had to also run a school. And when he was 53, he resigned on the grounds of old age and ill health. But the real reason was that the pupils were leaving the school because it was reasonable teaching standards. Then the Groot Trek happened, and there were no Dutch Reformed Church ministers. Nobody wanted to go because they had such a lovely life at the Cape. So, of course, his mother-in-law forced him to go. He didn't want to go because there was no alcohol. So Susanna and his mother-in-law said, okay, come on, let's go. And off he went as the official preacher to the trekkers. But he was so poor that he had to lend a wagon and oxen from his brother-in-law, Gerrit Maritz. Piet Retief was a very kind man. He took pity on Erasmus, and after crossing, he gave him an oxen and a wagon, and after crossing the Orange River, he helped ordain Erasmus as a Jiminy, because before that, he could preach a sermon and whatever, but he couldn't perform a marriage, a baptism, or a funeral service. And Gerrit Maritz was furious. He said, I want nothing to do with you or Retief after that. Took his oxen and his wagon and he parted ways. So off Erasmus' family went with Retief. And after Retief was murdered, the Smits trekked with Retief's widow to Pietermaritzburg. The trekkers' enclave was horrible. It was surrounded by a wooden palisade. They lived in abject poverty from hand to mouth. There were rats, wild dogs, scavenging. The only thing Susanna wrote, she was terribly grateful in a diary, that alcohol was scarce. But one up for her, she was a great feminist. Hendrik Klutty was then the British governor's representative, and the trekkers wanted a little bit of land. They wanted their own little republic. The British government said no. The men were so downhearted they just gave up. So Susanna organized all the women, stormed into his office, and when he wouldn't do it, they flapped their aprons up and down in his face. And they started to pull his hair, and he and his secretary ran running down out there for their lives, this unwomanly behavior. And then as they came out, they signaled to the men who set fire to the thatch of all the British government buildings. But it didn't help. They still didn't get their rights. So many of the trekkers left. They went back to the Eastern Cape or the Western Cape, wherever, and up north. But the Smits were so poor they had to stay. And Susanna died in 1683. She was 63. Erasmus was 85. He died a week later. He kept himself well pickled until that age. Right, now we have Lady Anne Barnard, who most people love, but to me, she was a real hypocrite. I mean, she wrote beautiful, I must say, I love all the books she wrote, and she told you all these skinner stories, which were wonderful about the Cape. And she had a carpenter and a tailor who lived with them, but they both loved their booze and they were always fighting. So she ordered the tailor to work upstairs and the carpenter to work downstairs. But then one day she owed the carpenter a guinea. So she gave him the guinea and said, not to spend it on alcohol. Not long afterwards, there was a terrible hullabaloo outside. So she and her husband ran out, and the pair of them were fighting it out drunk as skunks on a plank laid across the pool in the garden about to fall in. So she ran down to the stables for help. But the stable hands were all motherless, and so all the other male servants. They'd all had a wonderful party on the tailor's guinea. Lady Anne was terribly critical of the Dutch and even the English who stayed here. And she said the babies came too soon. A very wise Dutchman said, no, it's just the marriages that come too late. And her husband, Andrew, was years younger than her. He was a ne'er-do-well. His father was a minister. He'd blown all the money. And she was very wealthy. Her father had no sons. She was an heiress to estates and lots of money in Scotland. And Andrew had two sons that he had fathered by a courtesan in England. So I don't think she could criticize the Dutch, and they at least got married, and the words courtesans weren't around here that much. And when the British decided, okay, we're going to leave sometime, Lady Anne Barnard went back in 1802 already back to England. But Andrew stayed on for quite a while, a few years longer. Then he died at the Cape from a flu. And he sent his will. According to her will, she inherited everything he had, which wasn't much, except there was a big surprise. There was about a 5-year-old little daughter. And Lady Anne Barnard was very good. She sent for the child, and she brought her up and trained her to be her companion. She tried to introduce her into the elite society, but they would have none of her because she was a child of color. But she did get her married very well off in the end. So that was that for Andrew. Right, here we have Sir George Grey's statue. I don't know why they put his back to the South African Library. It should be facing the other way because he had a great hand in starting it and building it. He started off his career as governor in Australia. We had a checkered career on and off, and then they sent him to the Cape. And while he was in Australia, there he is, looking very self-satisfied. And that was his wife, Sarah. They had only one child who died as a baby in Australia. He was furious. He blamed Sarah for the death. He said it was neglect. He wouldn't speak to her at all. He just cold-shouldered for an entire year. She had to live in another part of the thing, of their house. So when they decided, British government decided to send him to the Cape, she went back to England. So he arrived here by himself. And he did very well until he blotted his copybook by arranging with the Boers to give him the Orange Free State. And of course, the British government were horrified. So they said, pack your bags, go back to England. And he was there for a couple of months or here, but his temporaries here were making such a bad job that they decided they could send him back to the Cape. And Sarah decided to come with them. And in those days, the boats had to, because of the winds, they had to tack across to almost South America. They didn't land. And then they'd turn and come back to Africa to get to the Cape. But this boat had to actually land in South America because George and his wife were fighting so that the whole boat could hear them. They were screaming, shouting, carrying on. He had found a love letter from her, and she had a lover in England, and he'd written all these seamy things in this love letter, and he was going berserk. So when the boat left for Cape Town, Sarah wasn't on it. She was in the next boat back to England, and he came back here. And he did fairly well while he was here. And then they decided, okay, he's got to go back to New Zealand. And there, ladies give him the thumbs up, because New Zealand, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, as they did in South Africa, were wanting the franchise for women. And there were only a few states in USA that had given it, not all of them, just a few, a handful where women had a franchise. And Sir George Grey allowed them to get the franchise in New Zealand, the whole country. So thumbs up for him. They were the first country to get the entire country for women's vote. And then he blotted his copybook again, so they sent him back to England. And he arrived there, and he was elderly, and he was ill, and he was so bad-tempered that nurse after nurse servant left. So in the end, his few friends begged Sarah to come and nurse him. And she was very good. She said, okay, I'll come. You write out this will, and I want copies in different safes, that everything you've got will be left to me when you die. So she nursed him for 2 years until he died, and she got everything. Right, so here we get diamonds have been discovered. And there's Barney Bernato. He was so poor, he couldn't even hitch a lift on an ox wagon. He walked all the way to Kimberley. And that's when he was doing a bit better. And there he met Leonard Cohen. And the two of them stayed together. And they were eventually getting a little bit more in their pockets, but still not doing that well. But they could afford to go to pubs and have a merry old time. It's a pub in Kimberley. But of course, the favorite pubs were the ones where the barmaids acted as prostitutes so that they could earn a bit of money. And then one day there was great news. There were two new ladies arrived in town, and they were virginal, and they were in beautiful white dresses and long streamers in their hair, and they had hired a very posh house. So Barney and Leonard ran like mad. They were the first in the queue with all the miners behind them. And as they walked in, it was already now dusk. The one said, okay, this is what we charge. And it was an enormous amount of money. And Leonard said, no ways, we can't afford that. And he was horrified because Barney took a wad of notes out and he handed it to her. And she was obviously a very trained prostitute. And she immediately went through the notes by candlelight and said, these are fake notes. And she's screaming and shouting. And the two of them ran down the road, chased by the miners who ran after them, but they got home safely. And then about 2-3 years later, Barney married a pianist in a pub. It was a very happy marriage. They got on very well. They had a lot of children. And as you know, he became richer and more wealthy. A beautiful house and grounds in England, had carriages, everything. Children sent to good schools. And they sailed back and forth from the Cape. And his last voyage on the way back to England, they don't know, did he fall? Did he jump? Was he pushed? And the official verdict was suicide because he was very depressed at the time. He'd suffered from depression for quite a while. But a lot of people at the time, and a lot of historians, point their finger at his arch enemy who reckon he was pushed, Cecil John Rhodes. Right, there he is. When he first arrived and he made his way up in the Cape, and he was governor, the Women's Temperance Union loved him because he gave them lots of money, and he gave them some money towards a Huguenot seminary and that, and they were invited to a lot of lunches with the parliamentarians, and they were horrified because they said after lunch that they would, because the luncheon wasn't at Parliament, it was further up, they would all stagger drunkenly back to Parliament and fall asleep in their seats and snore and not listen to what was going on. Nothing's changed. And of course, he fell out of favor with him. And also, he wouldn't allow a woman's franchise. That was a no-no. Another thing they were pressing for was the banning of the age of consent, which was 12 years old. They wanted it pushed up to 16 years old. Now, the age of consent applied only to women and girls. If you were 12 years old or older and a man sexually assaulted you, even raped you, you were responsible. The man was not responsible. You had given your consent. He just wouldn't. And then he met his nemesis, the so-called Princess Radziwill. She she said she was married to the Prince Radziwill. They were a Polish family, and she was separated from him. She had three daughters, and she was practicing as a journalist in London. And of course, when she heard that he was so wealthy and well connected, she wangled away to meet him. And she kept saying to him, "Oh, I'll come to the Cape, and I want to marry you." And he had nothing to do with it. And when she heard he was going back to the Cape, she got herself on the same boat that he was on. And when he was standing on deck the one day, she arrived, and she pretended to faint. And he was quick enough, he jumped aside, and she fell flat on the deck. And it didn't fall into his arms as she planned. But she didn't give up. When she got here, of course, the Cape Society thought, "Oh, it was wonderful, a princess," and they treated her royally, and she kept pitching up at Kritskier unannounced. And eventually what he did was he had a horse ready for his messenger at the gate who would gallop up to Kritskier and say, "She's here." And then he had a horse at the back entrance, and he would gallop away on that so he would miss her. And she stole documents. Nobody knows what they are, but Margaret Kins and a lot of eminent historians say it was definitely embroiling him in the Jamison rag, which of course he said he had nothing to do with, which nobody believes. But that didn't work. But then he died. And after he died, they went through all his papers, and they found she'd forged promissory notes. And she also claimed she'd had a baby daughter, their father. They couldn't find this child anywhere. It was supposed to have died, it was non-existent. And they agreed she was no princess. She was a courtesan living with the Prince Radziwill. She landed up in prison at the Cape. And after her release, she hightailed it with her three daughters to America. But at one of my talks, I had a gentleman come up to me afterwards, and he said, "But there was a daughter. It was my grandmother." I had to keep a straight face. And I said, "How do you know that?" "Oh," she said, "my parents had a farm up in the northwest near Prendal, Van Reinsdorp somewhere. And one day there was this very well-dressed Nama woman walking with this baby, beautifully dressed in a lovely shawl in her arms, and it was a white child. So my parents said, 'Where'd you get the baby from?' They said, 'Oh, this is Cecil Rhodes and the princess's daughter, and she was given to me to look after, but now he's died, I'm not getting any more money.' So they took her in, and that's my grandmother. So it's up to you to decide whether it's true or not." And then in the case of the Prince Radziwill, my aunt, my second youngest aunt, was married to Valery Pikel, whose father was the Russian Count Radziwill, and they were originally a Polish family. And he was 90 already, living in Sydney when he phoned me and he told me about all this. His father had fled during the Russian Revolution, and they'd changed his name to Pikel. And he said there is no trace. He gave me the entire family tree just about. There's no trace of this supposed princess. It was all total lies. She'd lied about every bit. She was a courtesan, and she had slept with the prince, and he had given her three daughters, and he supported her even though they were separated. And then just to end off, I'm sure a lot of you have read Philida Brooke Simon's beautiful coffee book Tables on the Cape. Her grandfather was Harry, and he was at one stage the secretary to Rhodes, and he was in charge of the gold fields and that. And Rhodes had no female servants or retainers anywhere. Everybody was male. None of his retainers or his staff were allowed to get married or engaged. And unfortunately, her grandfather fell in love with her grandmother, Ethel Reader Fairbridge. And secretly they got engaged. And a year later, they decided they must get married. And they tried to keep it quiet, but as they were, society, Rhodes got to hear of it. And he pitched up at the wedding. And Philida told me this, and it's also in one of the books she's written about it, that he squeezed her hand so hard that it almost broke her bones. And he said, I envy you, my dear. He didn't give him a wedding present at all. And then they went away for their 3 weeks honeymoon, and they came back. And Harry walks into the office, and Rhodes was sitting there, and he said, "Oh, here's your wedding present. You've got 3 days. Pack up and go to the Goldfield. You've got to go up there to that office." So he thought, "Okay, great. This is a promotion." And off he went with his bride, and a great to do. And they got there, and he walks into the office, and there's Rhodes, one of his youngest brothers, Ernest, sitting, and he's the manager. And Harry's just a bystander, but he had to do all the work, and Ernest kept messing everything up, and he kept blaming, said, "No, it's not me, it's this bloke you sent from the Cape." So eventually, after about a year and a half, they couldn't take it anymore, and the couple came back to Cape Town, and he stormed into Rhodes's office, and Rhodes sat there with the news, reading the newspaper with it up in front of his face, didn't even look at him. And he said, "Listen, he said, I want you to sort this out." So Rhodes said, "No, you dismissed it immediately because you were useless." She said, "Well, then I'm going to sue you for wrongful dismissal, and I'm going to lay everything bare that I know about you and your whole family." So in the end, Rhodes gave in and settled out of court. And that is a little snippet of what went on at the Cape. I hope you enjoyed it.